In the aftermath of World War II, the Soviet Union conducted public executions of German military and SS officers responsible for egregious war crimes on Soviet soil. Notably, Friedrich Jeckeln, an SS commander, orchestrated mass murders, including the Babi Yar massacre, where over 33,000 Jews were killed in a single operation. Captured by Soviet forces, Jeckeln was tried and executed in Riga in 1946. Similarly, Johann Georg Richert, a Wehrmacht general, commanded units that committed numerous atrocities against civilians in occupied Belarus. The German soldiers and officers sentenced to death by the Soviets were not random captives. Many of them were members of the Waffen-SS Gestapo or other Nazi organizations directly responsible for war crimes. These individuals had participated in mass executions, the destruction of entire villages, and the systematic torture of Soviet prisoners of war. In the Eastern Front, Nazi forces carried out some of the most brutal atrocities of the war. The execution squads known as Einsatzgruppen massacred hundreds of thousands of Soviet civilians, including women and children. The siege of Leningrad led to the deaths of nearly 1 million people due to starvation, while the occupation of Ukraine and Belarus was marked by horrific war crimes. Soviet authorities viewed captured German soldiers, especially those from elite or notorious units, as the embodiment of this brutality. Some executions targeted officers who had directly ordered massacres, while others included lower-ranking soldiers accused of committing war crimes under orders. In many cases, Soviet military tribunals relied on witness testimonies, captured Nazi documents, and the accounts of surviving victims to determine guilt. However, the trials were often swift, with little room for appeals or extended legal proceedings. For the Soviet leadership, these executions were not just about individual punishment. They were about justice for the millions who had suffered. The gallows were erected as grim monuments to the horrors inflicted on Soviet soil, and each execution was meant to serve as both retribution and deterrence. The Soviet military tribunals were vastly different from the international Nuremberg trials, which involved lengthy investigations and extensive legal defense for the accused. Instead, the Soviet justice system operated under a strict and expedited process designed to deliver rapid verdicts. Captured German officers and soldiers suspected of war crimes were often put on trial within days or weeks of their capture. The proceedings were usually held in Soviet-occupied cities, where the scars of Nazi occupation were still fresh. In some cases, tribunals took place in open-air settings, with local civilians invited to witness the sentencing. These trials were not just about legal proceedings. They were deeply symbolic moments of reckoning for communities that had suffered at the hands of the Nazis. The evidence against the accused ranged from documents detailing massacres to survivor testimonies. However, in some cases, the trials were based on circumstantial evidence or conducted with a predetermined outcome. The Soviet system did not always distinguish between high-ranking commanders who had ordered atrocities and ordinary Wehrmacht soldiers who had followed orders under duress. For some, this meant a death sentence based on collective guilt rather than direct responsibility. Once the verdict was reached, there was no lengthy appeals process. If a soldier or officer was sentenced to death, the execution was often carried out within hours or days. Public hangings were particularly common in regions that had suffered the most under German occupation, ensuring that the local population could witness what the Soviets considered justice being served. When the day of execution arrived, the setting was carefully orchestrated to maximize its impact. Soviet authorities often chose public squares or town centers, places where the German occupiers had once imposed their own rule. Now, in a stark reversal, It was the Nazis who stood as prisoners before their executioners. The condemned men were typically led to the gallows under heavy guard, their hands bound and their fates already sealed. Soviet officers would read out the charges against them, recounting the atrocities they had committed. For the crowd, many of whom had lost family members to Nazi brutality, this moment was deeply personal. Some cheered, others remained silent, while a few watched with grim satisfaction as justice unfolded before them. The executions were carried out by hanging, an intentionally humiliating and public form of capital punishment. Unlike a firing squad, which could be seen as a soldier's death, the gallows symbolized disgrace and total defeat. Some of the condemned faced their fate in silence, while others broke down, begging for mercy. Soviet authorities rarely granted last words, ensuring that the final moments of these men were defined not by defiance, but by powerlessness. Once the noose was tightened and the trapdoor released, the bodies were left hanging for hours, sometimes days, as a stark warning. The Soviet government wanted these executions to serve as both punishment and propaganda, a message that those who had brought war to their lands would pay the ultimate price. These public executions left a lasting impact on both Soviet society and the global perception of post-war justice. For many in the USSR, the hangings were a necessary act of retribution, a way to provide closure for the millions who had suffered under Nazi rule. The sheer scale of Soviet losses meant that few questioned the harshness of these sentences. However, outside the Soviet Union, reactions were more mixed. While the world widely condemned Nazi war crimes, some Western observers viewed the Soviet trials as acts of revenge rather than fair justice. Unlike the Nuremberg trials, which attempted to establish legal precedents for war crimes prosecution, the Soviet method often blurred the lines between justice and retaliation. There were also concerns about how these executions shaped the post-war world. By demonstrating their ability to enact swift and severe punishments, the Soviet Union reinforced its reputation as an unforgiving superpower. This approach to justice would later influence how the USSR handled political dissent, Cold War espionage cases, and even its own internal purges. For those who had witnessed the executions firsthand, the images remained unforgettable. The sight of German officers, once symbols of Nazi power, dangling lifeless from Soviet gallows, was a haunting reminder of the war's brutality. But whether these hangings were acts of true justice or merely the victor's revenge remained a question that history would continue to debate. The public executions of German soldiers on Soviet gallows were more than just moments of punishment. They were symbolic acts that reflected the immense suffering and anger of a nation devastated by war. But justice is often complicated. Were all those executed truly guilty of the crimes they were accused of, or did some simply fall victim to a system eager for revenge?